Welcome back, everyone. We are continuing the Caesar series, and this is Caesar versus the Helvetii. Don't know what that means, don't know what it's going to be about. That's the exciting part about series like this. We kind of just dive in, and we don't look back. So, this is 58 BCE, of course, 58 years until the turn of the millennia, in the 1st century BCE. Now, we saw last time in 59 BCE, Caesar became first consul. He was joined by his second consul, Bibracte, right? And they kind of just had fight after fight, not physically, but in politics. These individuals really didn't see eye to eye with each other from the beginning, conservative versus progressive. And, Caesar really took the horns. He grabbed the horns. There's some sort of simile there that I'm missing, but he basically added a lot more reform. He added Pompey's and Crassus, those two. He basically added those two as land commissioners, and he had so many different things that he wanted to accomplish, and he set out to do that. Now, there was a lot of pushback in the particular Senate, and now he's no longer consul. This is the next year. His two successors, which were a legate of Pompey, and then his father-in-law. So now what happens? Let's jump in and see. I said, let's jump in and see.
Remember back to Caesar's year as consul, when there had been a coordinated effort to sabotage his career by assigning him to govern the woodland and country lanes of Italy. After achieving dominance over the Senate, he had replaced this dead-end job with the governorship of two provinces, Illyricum and Cisalpine Gaul. Governing two provinces at once was unusual but not unprecedented. Then, when the governor of neighboring Transalpine Gaul unexpectedly died, he had that province assigned to himself as well.
Dang, that's a lot of territory. So basically, southern France to northern Italy through Balkans?
By the way, for the sake of simplicity, I keep on using the word governor, but the Romans used the words proconsul and propraetor, which doesn't exactly mean the same thing. Basically, if the Senate took a former consul and put them in charge of a province or at the head of an army, they were now a proconsul, which legally granted them some of the old command authority that they used to possess when they were in office. Command authority, the Romans had their own word for this too, imperium. A person with imperium was authorized to channel the power and authority of the state in order to enact their will. So governors, generals, judges, and high-ranking politicians literally embodied the Roman state. Diplomats also had imperium. There are famous stories about the over-the-top arrogance of Roman diplomats, talking down their noses at foreign kings. But look at it from their point of view. If Roman diplomats thought that they were the embodiment of the Roman state, it would be inappropriate for them to bow to a foreign king. It's easy to see why the Romans were awful diplomats.
That was a jab.
Another thing to keep in mind going forward. A person with imperium was immune from legal prosecution. You could always charge them later as a private citizen, but not while they had imperium. So, on January 1st of 58 BCE, Caesar became the proconsul in charge of Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul.
Where would he headquarter? Transalpine?
For a 5-year term. These three provinces had a total of 4 legions assigned to them, which at full strength would have been around 20,000 men. Caesar immediately began raising 2 more legions at his personal expense, bringing his total up to 6 legions and 30,000 men.
Okay.
Last year, when Caesar had secured new provinces, he had also given himself the power to appoint his own legates, which was usually the Senate's job. Just a reminder, a legate was the person in charge of each legion. So in this
a general?
Case, he had 6 jobs to fill. He gave one of these positions to a man named Labienus. Caesar and Labienus were the same age, and they had become good friends during the Catiline conspiracy, when Caesar had served as praetor and Labienus had been a tribune of the plebs. During Caesar's year as consul...
These are a lot of words. Oh my. So praetors, which are like governors, aedles, quaestors, tribunes of the plebs, consul. Oh, it's gonna take me a little bit to get used to all these words.
So Labienus had served with him as praetor. This made Labienus eligible for a province of his own, but instead he chose to come with Caesar and serve as his right-hand man. Later, when Caesar would get distracted by the day-to-day governance of the provinces, Labienus would be left in charge of the army. When circumstance required Caesar's presence elsewhere, Labienus would govern the provinces in his place. When Caesar's final term as governor ended, he would have Labienus appointed his successor.
So there was a process here. He wanted the three.
Near the beginning of
Makes
the year,
sense.
Caesar received word that a large tribe, the Helvetii, had uprooted and were
Oh.
migrating west. On their current trajectory, they were going to cut through Transalpine Gaul. Caesar ordered his legions to mobilize, and to travel to the edge of Roman territory near modern Geneva. There he had them break down a bridge over a river that the Helvetii would need to cross. When the Helvetii realized that there were 6 legions standing in their path, they formally requested passage through Roman territory. Caesar sent a response, saying something along the lines of, "Wait there, I'll think about it." A week passed in silence. Finally, Caesar sent a messenger denying their request, at which time they discovered that the Romans had secretly constructed a 28-kilometer line of defenses in front of the river. What was Caesar doing here? If you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you can. He would argue that the Romans were allied with many of the Gallic tribes in the area, and they didn't want 300,000 militaristic Helvetii moving into their territory and upsetting the delicate balance of power.
Okay.
But in my opinion, Caesar wasn't acting in good faith here. He had started mustering extra legions before the Helvetii had even entered the picture. If you ask me, this had more to do with Caesar settling his debts than it did with maintaining the status quo.
That's...
The Helvetii were upset by Caesar's refusal. Some of them were like, to hell with this, and decided to independently cross the river anyways. Caesar had anticipated this.
No.
He didn't have enough men to defend the entire 28-kilometer line at once, but wherever a group of Helvetii tried to push, Caesar and his men converged on that location. The Helvetii made several attempts over several days, but...
Did we say 300,000, by the way? Now, we gotta imagine 150,000 or so are probably ineligible to fight, probably. Another 20, 30,000 are probably not of age to fight. So you probably have like twice or 3x Helvetii than you do Romans in terms of fighting capacity. 6 legions, that's 30,000. They probably have 80 to 90,000 fighting men on their side. Interesting. That's just assumptions too.
Caesar repulsed them every time. The Helvetii were beaten and decided to go around Roman territory by marching north. Before too long, some of Rome's Gallic allies...
Right, not Alps. Maybe Alps. Maybe Alps. Yeah, Alps.
Started to get word of a massive Helvetii migration coming their way and sent panicked messages to Caesar asking for assistance. With this thin justification, Caesar set off in pursuit of the Helvetii and caught up with them at the Arar River, which we now call the Saône. The Helvetii were having difficulty with the river, and a simple crossing had dragged on for weeks. Caesar launched a surprise nighttime attack, but due to low visibility and general confusion, he was not very successful, and most of the Helvetii on his side of the river were able to retreat safely into the woods. The next morning, Caesar and his men started construction on a bridge across the river. They were finished within hours, and the next day Caesar and his 6 legions had crossed the river, and they were on to tracking the rest of the Helvetii. When Caesar caught up with them, the Helvetii sent a diplomat to meet with him. They didn't really accomplish anything, they just ended up airing grievances at each other. It now seemed pretty clear that there was going to be a battle. Caesar assembled his legions and sent his 4,000 cavalry forward to screen his infantry as they advanced. The cavalry walked right into an ambush. The ambush was small in scale, but the Romans still took heavy losses and were routed. This was Caesar's first proper military encounter in Gaul, and it ended in defeat.
Wow.
But it could have been a lot worse. At least the cavalry took the brunt of the attack, and were able to disengage when they were beaten. If the infantry had walked into this, it could have gone a lot differently. After this, Caesar must have felt humbled, because he moved much more cautiously. The Helvetii continued their migration north, and Caesar shadowed them the entire way. Whenever they stopped moving, the Helvetii would deploy for battle, but Caesar never took the bait. This went on for several days. One day, the Helvetii ended their march in front of a steep hill. Caesar pulled Labienus aside, and together they hatched a plan. In the middle of the night, Labienus was to march off with 2 of Caesar's most experienced legions. The plan was for Labienus to march all the way around the Helvetii position in the dark, and take the hill behind them before the sun came up. At dawn, Caesar would march out and deploy for battle. Labienus was to hold his position until the moment he saw Caesar's forces come into contact with the Helvetii. When that happened, he was to charge downhill and hit them in the rear. A key ingredient to this plan was trusting that the Helvetii wouldn't be stupid enough to attack uphill, even though they would outnumber Labienus's detachment 7 or 8 to 1. If they did attack uphill, that would screw up the plan a little bit, but all Labienus would need to do was hold off the Helvetii until Caesar could come to the rescue. That's why he had the 2 most experienced legions with him. So in the middle of the night, Labienus marched off with his legions, and at dawn, Caesar and the remaining 4 legions marched out of their fortified encampment to meet the Helvetii.
I mean, they are definitely superior, the Romans, it seems, in terms of like military function, military equipment. I feel like the Helvetii, like a precursor to what we call barbarism. Not in the sense of negative connotation, but more or less in terms of just a migrating peoples or tribe. So that's probably the only reason that there is such battle that is taking place with such a large disadvantage in number.
Making as much commotion as possible. He sent his cavalry to scout ahead. Before long, his scouts came back, with reports that there were Helvetii all over the hillside, and Labienus was nowhere to be found. This was bad. Caesar abruptly threw his legions into a defensive line. Then he sent out all of his scouts with very simple orders. Find out what happened to Labienus's legions. They stayed deployed like this all day, prepared for an overwhelming attack, but it never came. Finally, the scouts came back. Labienus had been waiting on the hill the entire time. The first report had been wrong. The Helvetii had been completely unaware that anything was going on. Caesar must have been pretty angry because when he was writing his account of this incident 12 years later, he names names and throws the scouts responsible under the bus. By this point, it was near dusk, so Caesar sent a messenger to Labienus, telling him to abandon the plan and come back to camp. The next day, Caesar finally had to deal with the fact that his army was down to 2 more days of food. Some of his Gallic allies had been promising a food shipment for a while now, but these were Gauls of questionable loyalty, and so far none had arrived. But there was an allied Gallic outpost nearby, and if the Romans left first thing in the morning, they could make it there by sundown. That was the new plan. Caesar would get the food himself, and then he would continue to shadow the Helvetii. The Romans marched away. But unbeknownst to Caesar, it was his turn to be shadowed.
Oh!
Caesar had just begun his forced march to resupply when all of a sudden he had Helvetii attacking the rear of his column. He didn't see this one coming. The infantry at the rear of the column turned to fight, and Caesar ordered all of his cavalry to go and help them. There was a small hill nearby, so he repositioned the rest of his infantry there and had them deploy for battle. This may have taken several hours, especially since Caesar had 10,000 raw recruits under his command. He put his 4 experienced legions up at the front, and his 2 inexperienced ones in reserve. When the
That's 3 and 2.
Infantry was finally in position, a signal was given, and the Romans who had been holding the Helvetii off fell back to the Roman line.
That makes sense.
The Helvetii advanced slowly up the hill, and the Romans held their ground. When they were in range, the 4 legions at the front threw their javelins, and sent their first 2 lines charging down the hill. The fighting was evenly matched for some time, but the Romans held the high ground, and the Helvetii gradually started to be pushed down the hill. Suddenly, a 3rd army entered the battlefield. 2 local Gallic tribes had allied themselves with the Helvetii. They had been sluggish in their pursuit of the Romans, but all 15,000 of them arrived with the battle already in progress. In this period, it was very common for armies to commit most of their men in the first wave, in the hopes that their overwhelming numbers would cause a rout. The Romans were weirdos, and their system kept a large percentage of their army in reserve, but it was designed for moments like this. The Roman third line was a cross-section of the most experienced soldiers under Caesar's command. There were, at most, 6,500 of them, but probably less. and when they moved up, they stopped the 15,000 Helvetii reinforcements in their tracks. Neither side had a clear advantage, and the battle dragged on all day. Caesar held his raw recruits back. It wasn't clear that they were capable of holding their own against the Helvetii, and Caesar didn't want to risk it. The Romans kept on making incremental progress here and there, but it was exhausting work, and both sides were taking heavy losses. The sun went down and they were still fighting. Eventually, the Helvetii had been reduced by an astonishing 2/3, and they pulled back, dejected and thoroughly beaten. The Romans were totally exhausted, even in victory. They had lost 5,000 men, which was a quarter of their most experienced soldiers.
An entire legion.
Caesar's army was truly shaken, and it took them a full 3 days to recover and tend to their wounded. They had captured some Helvetii supply wagons, so their food problem was now taken care of. Once the Romans were well enough to be on the march again, they were immediately met with a Helvetii delegation offering terms of surrender. Caesar accepted. He had the Helvetii hand over all of their weapons, allowed them to leave Gaul with their lives and go home, on the condition that in the future they would provide fighting men to the Roman Republic upon request. They agreed.
Oh.
This was the beginning of the so-called Gallic Wars, a series of campaigns that began here in 58 BCE and ended in 51 BCE, just after the Battle of Alesia. Campaigns that began ostensibly to stabilize neighboring Gaul by restricting the movement of people, ended with its subjugation.
Jeez, that was interesting. Wow. So the Gallic Wars really began with the Helvetii, and Helvetii are migrating through this region. I'm guessing I'm not sure, I'm not going to make an assumption. Are they a Germanic tribe? And where did they go afterwards? Did they go towards like the Lithuania-ish area? Did they go like north? Where did they go? And are they just on standby for future wars, maybe against, I don't know, Germany-ish, Germanic places, Gaul, eventually Britons? I don't know. This is super cool though. I'm very interested in learning more. This is the genesis of the Gallic Wars. And this is segmented from the Roman government. This is more of a governorship that has deployed this power of the state initiative of 6 legions. It's just so cool. Yeah. Guys, what do you guys think? Let me know below. This was fun. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you want more. Peace out. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.